keeping some of these details vague because I seriously don't want the host to find out that I published this story. I don't think they would approve. I hope that is alright, and I'll try to make it as comprehensive as possible. I spent a year studying in Mexico recently, and as you do on exchange, I tried to travel as much as I could. Between the semesters, there was a big break, and me and my buddy that I spent the most time with during the exchange decided that we'd go on a longer backpacking trip to Mexico together. We had a rough plan on where to go and what we wanted to see, but we hadn't even booked our flight back yet, nor were we sure from where we would take it from. We wanted to keep it flexible. We had an amazing time, and a few days before our trip ended, we finally decided we would take our flight from a city that was close and had really cheap flights, but the city itself didn't really have anything to offer. Then on Airbnb, we found a room very close to the airport in a house with a pool, and we thought we'd just treat ourselves to a relaxed pool day at the end of the trip. It turned out that the hosts were a family. The husband was Mexican and the wife was from Europe, could even speak our native language. So we arranged that we would take a bus to the airport and that they would pick us up from there. When we finally arrived to the city, it was already dark, and the bus driver refused to drive us to the airport since it was not directly on his route, so he just dropped us off on the highway. That was already a pretty shitty situation to begin with, standing with our backpacks at the side of the road in the middle of nowhere in a not-so-safe city in Mexico. But I called the host and sent them our GPS location, and they say no problem and that they will come get us. So the husband came to pick us up, and it was a very uncomfortable situation getting into the car with a stranger in the night, in the middle of nowhere. It also didn't help that the guy looked like Danny Trejo without a mustache, and as I tried to make small talk with him, he only gave monosyllabic answers or straight out ignored me. Well, he's just not a big talker, I thought, and I hoped we would arrive soon. Looking back, I can see a million red flags, but for some reason at that time, we just didn't see them. Either we were too tired, or to be honest, we didn't really have any other choice than going along anyway, so. But yes, we arrive, and that should have immediately set alarms off. We were in the middle of nowhere. There were fields with sheep and goats around, and all of a sudden, a gravel road branches off from the paved road, and along that gravel road, there are about 6 huge mansions. All with 2-meter walls around them, topped with NATO fence huge gates and at least 2 gigantic guard dogs per house. When we entered their house, we were greeted by the wife, a bubbly middle-aged woman that was very talkative but pleasant. She had actually cooked dinner for us, and we ate while exchanging small talk. The husband just sat at the table not saying a single word. After dinner, we more or less went directly to bed because it had gotten late, and we were tired from a long day. The next morning, we saw that the weather was not that good, so we decided to go into town and just see a few touristy things it had to offer, instead of spending it at the pool. When we came back, it was already dark, but we decided to jump into the pool anyways to cool off, because it was really hot and humid. The wife joined us, and at some point, my friend made the mistake to ask how they were able to afford such a house. It didn't really match the price range of the jobs they were telling us that they were doing. And she deflected a bit and added that her husband was very handy because he had grown up in the streets and basically built a house himself. We realized that it was maybe not the best topic, and we broke the conversation off. That was the last day of our trip, and we had our flight back home early in the morning. We still had some weed left that we had brought on the trip, and we thought it would be nice to smoke one, since it was our last night. But as this was a family home and they had kids around, we thought it would be better to speak to our hosts if they would mind. So later in the evening, we asked the wife if it would be okay if we smoked on the property, which for some reason she found quite amusing and started laughing. She shouted to her husband, who was lying on the couch watching TV, "My love, the boys asked if it would be okay if they smoked some weed. What do you think?" And he just laughed but didn't give an answer. He looked at her with a dumbfounded expression as she told us sure, just go ahead. So we went to the terrace and started smoking our joint. Later, they joined us and we just had a chat. And this is where things got really fucked up. For some reason, they started asking all sorts of questions about the weed. Where we got it, how much it was, who we got it from, and how much we would have to pay for that back in Europe. They just seemed way too interested in the weed, and at one point, the wife just nonchalantly revealed to us, yes, we thought about doing that as a source of income, selling weed, but too many people die doing that, because the cartels don't like that. Actually, my husband used to kill people for doing that. I immediately felt sober. Did she just say? And as if he read my mind, her husband added, yes, when I was about 16, I killed a lot of people for the cartel for money. and he said it in a tone as if he had just used to mow lawns when he was a teenager. I still thought I must have misunderstood, so I texted my friend who was sitting across the table from me, trying not to make eye contact, because I knew we would freak each other out. He confirmed that I had indeed understood right. We discussed what we should do and agreed that there's no immediate threat and that we should just stay. We don't have anywhere else to go anyways, and it's already late. But things got even crazier. We tried to keep our composure and not completely freak out while still making conversation with our hosts. A few minutes later, though, the husband got up and went inside to get something. And he came back with a literal kilo of weed, pressed into a brick. He proceeded to break bits off the brick and roll them into a joint that would probably have knocked out Snoop Dogg. It was about the size of my thumb, and I guess it had about 2 grams of weed in there. Of course, he offered the joint to us, but we politely declined, saying that we were already pretty stoned. He seemed a little offended, but fortunately, he bought our excuse. But it got even worse. A few minutes later, we hear a couple of loud bangs. The wife became a bit uneasy and asked, "What was that?" To which he answered calmly, 9mm. To confirm my suspicion, that had indeed been shots. I would say it was around 7 or something shots, fired pretty quickly after each other. The wife got nervous and asked if we should maybe go inside. "What do you think they are shooting at in the air? At cows? At people?" But he just shrugged it off and we stayed outside. Again, a few minutes later, there were more shots, but this time even closer. The wife got even more upset and asked again, "Should we go inside? What do you think they are shooting at? We need to go inside." And I think I'll never forget when he answered in the calmest way imaginable, "No, everything's okay. I didn't hear any screams yet." I don't know why, but the way he just calmly said that freaked me out, and it is still making my heart beat whenever I think about it. After that, we quickly excused ourselves and went to our room. When we could finally talk, we basically both lost it and panicked. What the hell were we supposed to do? We are locked in a house with a contract killer in the middle of absolutely nowhere. People are shooting outside. We decided it was probably our best bet to stay because we thought, well, we are his guests and he is not going to harm us. And it's better to have walls and dogs and a serial killer in between us and people shooting around. So we barricaded ourselves into the room and didn't sleep a second until the morning, when we noped the hell out of there and went to the airport. I was never so happy to be patted down in security my whole life. The year 2018, me and 3 other friends, we were all males in our early 20s, decided to travel to Bali for a week since it was cheap and we had time, so why not? Our itinerary includes sightseeing, trying local foods, mountain climbing, visiting bars at the beach, basically a typical vacation in Indonesia. It was honestly quite a surreal experience. The country is absolutely beautiful and the food was amazing. The only issue I had about the trip were the locals. Drugs were really prominent there, especially mushrooms. The streets were filled with druggies, dying to sell us their drugs. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. One dude even grabbed my arm because I ignored his 2-for-1 deal for a one-way trip to meet Jesus. I shrugged him off while my friends laughed it off, suggesting that I may be passing up the chance to meet our Lord and Savior. He looked rabid and frantic, like he was about to pounce onto me like a dog diagnosed with rabies. I didn't feel too afraid as we were confident that we could handle them, since half of them were not even sober. However, that is only the tip of the iceberg. The horror starts when we went back to our Airbnb for the night. We had an early day the next morning and we were exhausted. The place was extremely cheap and it didn't even have a proper locking mechanism for the door. It had 2 wooden doors, which swing inwards, and the only way to lock them was to wedge a wooden block through the holes mounted on the door. It was quite a primitive lock, but it gets the job done, I guess. Everything was going well until the last night of our trip, when we realized that the wooden block was missing. We looked everywhere for it, but to no avail. I just figured that one of us must have misplaced it somewhere. We settled for using a selfie stick. I know it sounds like a horrible idea. Instead, since we didn't have anything that fits the holes to wedge the door close, we turned in for the night, seemingly not expecting anything since we had already stayed there for 6 days with no issues. I woke up to strange clicking sounds in the dead of the night. I got out of my bed, and I thought that maybe it's one of the guys, so I nonchalantly approached the noise. My friends were all sleeping, so I decided to investigate the cause of the noise. The The ruckus seemed to be coming from the door, so I headed towards them, feeling extremely confused. Who could be at our doorstep at this time of the night? I noticed the doors were slightly open and the selfie stick was horribly deformed. I peeked outside and I saw 3 people staring through the gap between the doors. They were really close to the entrance and were attempting to push the doors open. I yelled at them, questioning their intentions, as I noticed one of them was holding the wooden block. I was shocked and puzzled at the situation as I recognized one of the men. He did the overall cleaning for the Airbnbs and pathways during the day, so there is no reason for him to be there at 3 a.m. The other dude asked if the wooden block belonged to us, as they allegedly found it outside for the Airbnb. I definitely smelled bullshit, as there was absolutely no reason to do that at 3 a.m. I called for my guys, and the 3 men immediately ran for it. I clued in the guys on the circumstances, and we stayed up until morning came in case they tried anything funny. We decided to report to the reception about their employee, but the description I gave them were not synonymous with theirs. They told me the housekeepers they hired consists of only females in their late 30s and 40s. This sent shivers down our spines as we came to realize that we had let a complete imposter in and out of our rooms while we were out. Luckily, nothing important was lost, and we got out of the situation safely. But I can't imagine what would have happened if I didn't wake up on that fateful night, as the doors were close to being opened. I was just grateful that it was our last night there. I was traveling around the country in my car. I have been driving for over a week from the city I lived in, and I have so far slept in my car to save money. It wasn't until I got to a big enough city that I decided to treat myself to an actual bed that would be comfortable. I opted to choose Airbnb because it's cheaper than most hotels. I booked this Airbnb the day before I arrived to the city, so there weren't many options left. I had found this apartment on Airbnb that looked very new and modern, and it was in a great location. The price was decent for its location, and it almost seemed too good to be true. The only downfall was that it was listed as a new listing and had 0 reviews. I figured that the price was low because it was a new listing, and I just decided to give it a shot. Must be legit because it's Airbnb, right? When I got to the apartment building, it was older looking than I had expected. I later found out and realized that my Airbnb was most likely the only renovated apartment in the building, and the building seemed to be in poor condition. It looked more like a dorm hall rather than an apartment building. Anyways, I let it all slide because I wasn't paying too much, so what could I expect? The apartment itself looked like the pigs, so that was good enough for me. Everything went well for the first few days. As a female traveling alone, I always make sure to be safe. I don't go out when it's dark, and I always lock the door. Every single lock, including the chain thing. Anyways, on the 3rd day, I was out all morning, and I came back to the apartment to change to head to the beach. I had again locked the door, including the chain. I was in front of the door watching TV while changing, when the door suddenly unlocks and someone opens the door. I am just beyond lucky that I had put the lock chain on the door, or else it would have opened all the way. I was naked and no one else was supposed to have the keys. My first reaction was, "Excuse me," and I closed the door right away, locking it again. I came from the back of the door and I didn't look or see who was opening it. I sat in front of the door scared and shocked, realizing that this person could technically still get in here, since they obviously have the keys to the apartment. At first, I thought maybe it was the owner coming back after I checked out, but I was not supposed to check out until the following day, so it was not possible. After crying for a few minutes, I recuperated myself and called the owner and told her what happened. She told me that no one else should have a set of keys other than her and I, and that she is at work and it was not her. I was scared to stay in the apartment because someone could come in, and I didn't want to leave because I had all my valuables there. It was a lose-lose situation. I then called my dad, who told me that it was not okay, that someone has the keys and that she needs to take care of this ASAP. So he talked to her, and she told me that she'll be there shortly with a locksmith to change it and give me a pair of new keys. She then proceeded to tell me that she'd only had this apartment for 6 months, and that before I stayed there was only one other Airbnb booking. She also mentioned that it had been sitting empty other than those 2 bookings because she had been renovating the apartment, which now makes sense why the building looks like absolute shit and doesn't match the apartment. She told me that the only possibility for who it could have been was the previous owners or someone related to them. But isn't that illegal? That possibility or theory really messed with me. How was it possible that I was gone all day, every day, and the 10 minutes I was home, during the daytime, someone tries to come in? Did they know I was there, and what were they coming in for? If this apartment had been sitting empty for half of a year, maybe they did this frequently, or maybe they saw me come in and tried to do something to me. These questions are constantly on my mind. I just know that I am lucky that I put the keychain on the door, or else. I don't even want to know what else could have happened. Needless to say, I won't be leaving a good review, and I won't be staying in an Airbnb that has no reviews or seems too good to be true. In summer 2019, my partner and I, both early 20s, decided to take a road trip to Vancouver, Canada, and stay at Golden Ears Provincial Park. We liked camping and had spring break and wanted to do something different and make the most out of our vacation. My partner had never been out of the US, and it seemed like a crazy new experience. It was a 6-day trip with Airbnbs in each state. The grand finale was a reserved campsite at Golden Ears, and it was close to the water. All wet lake. We packed terribly and had a giant tent, brought a bunch of fruit and veggies to eat healthily and stored them in a cooler that was too small, and brought a cutting board and knife to break up the snacks while driving. We started in California and switched off driving our bright red Ford Fiesta. We drove through Oregon and Washington and finally made it to Vancouver. We spent a day or two in each state, drank a little too much, and stayed out late. Canada was the best part, and all wet lake felt like walking in a painting. We walked barefoot on the rocks with our toes in the freezing cold lake, and we hiked around. Saw a beautiful waterfall where we saw a couple taking pics of each other for an hour, and we started modeling the same poses from far away. Everything was perfect, and the campsite was empty, except for the other couple. We went to bed early that night. It was quiet, and I woke up to crackling outside the tent. My partner was still asleep and snoring. I didn't think much of it because it was pitch black and probably an animal. The crackling continued closer to the tent. I sat up and grabbed my phone, and the brightness came on, and I turned it off, almost blinding myself with light. In those 2 seconds, I could make out a person right outside our tent. I froze and sat up. They weren't moving and were close enough to unzip the tent. I started poking my partner because I had no idea what to do. They woke up, and I said, "There is someone outside the tent." Then I hear footsteps, quiet footsteps walking out of our campsite. My partner starts loudly saying, "What?" repeatedly in a sleepy haze. A car or truck is parked right outside our camping area, and no one is near our campsite. It starts up and then drives off. They didn't turn their lights on until they turned the corner, and we were out of view, so I couldn't make out much, but it looked like a truck. Now I'm shaking and my partner can't put together what's happening. I want to leave, but Golden Ears locks the gate until 6 or 7 a.m., and it's only 1 a.m. So we are going to be here for now. I make us move to the Ford Fiesta, and we sleep in the tightly packed car. She falls asleep immediately and thinks I'm paranoid, but could it have been a park ranger or something? It seemed too weird of behavior for a park ranger. I sit there wide awake for about 2 hours. The car is locked and I want to sleep, but can't. I'm in the passenger seat, my partner in the driver's seat asleep, and it's 3 a.m. I'm sitting half awake. I hear a car slowly driving up the road, lights off as it rounds the corner. It had to be the same truck, and I was scared, but my adrenaline was pumping. It slowly rounds the corner and pulls up directly in front of our campsite, again in the same spot. I feel like I'm going to throw up. I had no weapon, but the kitchen knife we brought for the fruits and veggies, so I grabbed the knife and I tried to make myself look angry, crazy, and big. I sit straight up in the passenger seat holding the kitchen knife. I keep it straight up at eye level and stare deadpan out at this truck in the pitch black, just like the father in the American Gothic painting. The truck stops and turns off. A light shines directly into my face coming from inside the truck, and I stare back terrified. In my bright red Ford Fiesta, holding my large kitchen knife, not blinking. The truck starts up and turns on its lights, and they stay on, blinding me. Then it pulls out and turns around and goes back to where it came from. My heart is literally pounding, and I wake up my partner and say that we need to get the hell out of here. We pack by just throwing things into our car and sit there awake until 6 a.m. We drive home and don't stop. We just keep rehashing and trying to make sense of the situation. We ultimately decide that we both need some sleep. I think I may die in this Airbnb. I don't know where my friends are, and I don't even know where I am. None of us would have been able to afford this on our own. Even with 5 of us, it was still pricey, but to be fair, it was one hell of a house. It was 3 stories with dark scallop siding. Paul had grown up in the area and he had found the place. He had heard all sorts of things about the place being haunted and some of the dark history growing up, but it hadn't been open to the public back then. When we chose this town as our friendcation destination, he jumped at the chance to stay here. I was intrigued, but the prospect of staying somewhere haunted excited me a lot less than it did my friends. From the moment we walked in, Ida and I seemed to both pick up on the vibes that unnerved us. As Katie, Diane, and Paul went room to room looking around excitedly, we both hung back and hovered closer to the front door. The house was beautiful, yes, but in a foreboding sort of way. The dark wood and stained glass meant that very little light truly filtered in, even in the peak daylight hours. The old floorboards protested our friends' steps as they explored the house. A door off to the side of the kitchen caught my attention, and I found myself drawn to it. Inside was a staircase. It was narrow and incredibly steep. You could only see a few steps before it rose out of our sight completely. It looked old, and to be honest, terrifying. "Ada, do you want to join the tour?" Paul shouted down to us. Paul guided us around like an expert and shared trivia about the house. Even though he claimed he had never been there before, he talked about the place like it was an old friend. He was the newest one to our friend group, and I had only known him for a few months, but this was the most excited I had ever seen him. He was almost giddy. The house was large enough for each of us to have our own room. I wasn't excited about that. The last thing my overactive imagination and I needed were a giant room to myself. Just my eyes began to close that night. I thought I heard something move along the floor above me. It sounded like something large and wet was being dragged along the floor. No, not passively dragged. It was crawling. I could hear a faint mournful sighing sound through the grate on the wall. I turned on my phone and listened to some music to drown it out. It sounded like it was moaning now. I turned the music up louder, covered my head with a blanket. I burrowed my headphones into my ears deep enough to cause future hearing loss. If you can't hear it, it can't hurt you, right? Somehow, I did manage to fall asleep. I asked the others if they had any odd experiences, but it was just me. Paul looked excited. He had lots of questions. He truly was hoping the house was haunted. I just told him I heard footsteps. I felt like that made me sound less crazy than if I said I heard something crying out in the night. He looked at me with a sly smile, almost as if he knew I was lying. We spent the day in town and had an amazing time. Katie asked around about the house we were staying in, and an older man at a little ice cream shop we visited told us that he thought it was irresponsible and dangerous to rent the place out after what had happened there. It turns out a number of tragedies occurred there, from as recent as the owners before our Airbnb host, and then dating back to nearly 200 years earlier. He mentioned how he believed that enough suffering could result in opening a door and letting something in. "So, do you think it's haunted?" Diane asked. Her green eyes wide. She had been hanging on to the man's every word. "Well, I always thought that haunted implied that a human passed on but never left." He scratched his chin, leaned in for effect. "But I don't think that walks those halls was ever human." His words hovered over me the rest of the day like a dark cloud. The sounds from upstairs continued on the second night. The wet slaps, followed by slow drags and cries above me, sickened me. I mentally nicknamed whatever was making those sounds the Crawler, and immediately regretted it because giving it a name did not quell my fears. I turned music on again. I woke up around midnight and the album had ended, but luckily so had the disturbing sounds from upstairs. I heard voices coming from the living room area and figured I'd see if my friends were also being kept up too. But there wasn't anyone there. It wasn't like I had just missed them. In this house, the creaky floor would have indicated their movement. I tried to quietly slide back to my room, with my socks gliding across the smooth wooden floors. Not too long after I had closed the door, someone gently rapped their knuckles on my door. It was as if they had been steps behind me the whole time. But why hadn't I heard them then? "Can I come in?" Katie whispered. I was so relieved. The house was really getting to me, and I was grateful for the company. Before I could even answer, she repeated herself in a more singy-songy voice. "Can I come in? I want to show you something." She called out my name, but struggled to pronounce it, almost like she'd never said it before. I froze. Sure, my name may not be all that common here, but we'd known each other for a decade. She always pronounced it with ease. At my lack of response, it sounded like she was pawing at the door. She let out a sound reminiscent of a wounded animal. I turned all the lights on in the room, and I spent the rest of my sleepless night trying to figure out how to tell my friends I wasn't going to spend another night here. I would still pay my portion, of course, but I was going to be staying in town tomorrow night. I smiled to myself at the thought. Yep, staying in town tomorrow, in a hotel. I'd have to use some of my savings, but it'd be worth it. The next morning, Paul stared at me, transfixed. "Hey," he leaned towards me. "What was up with you last night?" "You came to my door. You kept trying to get me to come to the basement with you, remember?" I had never gone to Paul's room. I was too busy with my own ordeal. Ada and Diane had similar stories when they came down. One of us came to their room and said something along the lines of, "Have you seen the basement yet? Let me show you," and tried to lead them down there. None of us opened the door. Diana, because she was too tired and not in the mood to socialize. Paul, because he didn't know me that well and thought I was acting strange. Ada, like me, had the feeling that the visitor at her door was not one of us. Paul and Diana were accepted by this, seeming confirmation that our Airbnb was haunted. Ada stared at me, her face grim. As for Katie, well, she never came to breakfast at all. We had plans, and when by noon Katie still hadn't come downstairs, I volunteered to check on her. I ascended the stairs, taking in the unique features of the house. Instead of an open space in the atrium on the third floor, there was a beautiful stained glass window, placed horizontally. On the roof parallel was a skylight where the sunlight filtered through. It cast red and purple swatches of light on the floor below. I had never seen anything like it before. I'm sure this won't come as a surprise to you, but Katie wasn't in her room. I heard steps above me on the third floor. I was much braver in the light of day, so I ascended the second flight of stairs and went room to room on the third floor. No one was there, but it was cold, much colder than the second or first floors. I went back to the second floor, trying to fight the urge to glance over my shoulder. I paused in front of the door of the room above mine, where I had heard the crawling and mournful wail the past 2 nights. I considered it for a moment, and I decided to open it. It was locked. Part of me was relieved. While I was upstairs, our friends had checked around the grounds. The only places they hadn't checked was the basement and whatever was up the stairs in the kitchen. We had regrouped in the kitchen and stared at the dark, steep stairs. Paul said he'd check the basement if one of us could please take the kitchen stairs. The tight space made him nervous, he said. It seemed like a fair trade. After a moment of awkward silence, Diane volunteered, to my immense relief. She was also the smallest of us, a petite 5'1". Even then, she still had to crawl on her hands and knees to ascend the stairs. We waited. We heard her walk around above us, calling out for Katie. She was up there a while. It sounded like the space was massive. My stomach dropped as I realized I heard 2 pairs of footsteps, one above my head and another further into the kitchen, but moving towards the person above me. "Diane," I hissed up the stairs frantically. No answer. I took a deep breath and prepared to ascend after her. Just as I had crawled up about 3 steps, someone moved to stand at the top, blocking the already limited light. I yelped and took a backwards leap and nearly hit my head on the doorframe. I instinctively stood behind the tallest person in the kitchen, Ada, who had a couple of inches on me. Diane emerged. She was walking like a normal bipedal person. I must have imagined what I saw in the darkness. "Well," Paul asked, "was Katie up there?" Diane cracked her neck on each side, stared and smiled at each of us, like she was taking in each of our faces for the first time. She shook her head slowly. She gave me a smile unlike the one she flashed at Paul and Ada, and she winked at me. She smelled of old things, and looked disheveled and walked stiffly. We looked around. The thing is, there was no door to the basement that we could find. Ada sent what we hoped was a nonchalant message that we all crafted together to the host, asking them where the basement was. We received the unsettling reply immediately. "There is no basement. Paul laughed at that, and Diane smiled dreamily and stared up at the stained glass skylight. It was like she was in her own world ever since her stint up the small stairs. Ada and I looked at each other nervously. We went into town to see if anyone had seen Katie and spent the rest of the day searching for her. We sat together in silence. The large living room felt emptier without Katie. We stared at a pizza that none of us felt like eating. Looked like I was spending the night here again after all. I locked my door that night. Around what had become the usual time, I heard the wet, dragging, crawling sounds upstairs. I tried to not picture what the thing making the sounds must look like. At home, I always slept with a weighted blanket on me. It made me feel safe. It was just a thin sheet and old quilt. I couldn't help but feel exposed here. Around 3 a.m., I awoke to moaning and scraping outside my door. "I need your help." I tried to place the voice. It was low but sounded female. It wasn't Ada, it wasn't Katie. It didn't sound like Diane. "It's me, Diane." I didn't reply. The cadence was also odd. The doorknob turned, quickly and aggressively. I tried to remain silent, motionless. "I need your help. My skin, it's too tight. It doesn't fit." I sat up against the headboard with my hands over my mouth, focusing on breathing as quietly as possible as it pounded at the door. Eventually, the steps faded away. The next morning, Ada looked happy. She was practically beaming. I realized that she looked different. Ada always wore her meticulously applied cat eyeliner and her purple lipstick, but this morning she had no makeup on. Her blue-black hair looked odd, but her bangs that were usually carefully styled and ended in a delicate point between her brows were hastily brushed off to one side. I'd always admired how she presented herself and wished I had the skill and patience. She didn't look bad this morning, but she didn't look like herself either. Diane and Paul hadn't come down. "I'm going to look for the others," I whispered. "You should look up there," Ada whispered, in the same husky foreign voice that I heard last night outside my door. She pointed to the kitchen stairs. I felt my throat tighten. I shook my head quickly, and she responded with a smile. I half expected her to leap at me or follow me on my search for Paul and Diane, but she didn't. Instead, she crawled back up those narrow, thin nightmare stairs, showing the same oddly proportioned dexterity that Diane had demonstrated the day before. I knocked on Paul's door nervously. It was also locked. I continued to knock until he came to the door, groggy. He seemed mildly annoyed at the intrusion. He blocked the view into his room with his body. When I told him I couldn't find Diane, he told me he'd meet me downstairs. Diane was nowhere to be found. Ada had yet to come back from the room above the kitchen. I could hear tearing and wet chewing sounds coming from up the stairs. I locked the door wordlessly, and I tried to fight back the bile rising in my throat. I tried to tell Paul we needed to leave, while it was still daylight. I didn't want to leave our friends either, but we needed to come back with more people because something terrible was going on. We were outmatched. We were probably outnumbered. Paul tried to convince me to stay. Surely there was an explanation. We couldn't take the car and leave our friends here. He looked at me accusingly. I loved our friends too, but I wasn't going to spend another night in this place. I thought of the crawler upstairs behind its locked door, dragging its heavy body across the floor like wet meat, crying out in the darkness for who knows what. I thought of Diane's odd behavior and subsequent disappearance. I thought of Katie, who had a crush on Paul. If she heard his voice outside her door, I'm sure she would have followed him. I thought of the thing that was likely wearing Ada's skin, eating something messily upstairs. I vaguely wondered if Paul and I were the only ones left. I told him I was leaving. As I was packing up, I felt a sharp blow and everything went dark. I woke up in the basement. Turns out there was a basement after all. Katie was down here too. She seemed to be pinned to the wall by her wrists, with her eyes glassy. She stared ahead, unblinking and pale. "Katie," I hissed at her. She weakly turned her head toward me. She was wearing the same clothes she had on 2 days ago. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. I was just relieved that she was alive. I heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Paul. He was carrying an ice chest and a satchel of tools. I had never been happier to see him. He came to me, squatted by me, and patted me on the head like I was a child, beaming. "You're awake. Great. We've still got more mouths to feed." He rubbed his hands together excitedly, and there was a kind of madness in his eyes. Despite all the terrifying things I'd experienced in this house, Realizing that Paul was a part of whatever was happening was 10 times worse. The small remaining hope I had flickered out in that moment. While he fiddled with the tools, selecting something long and sharp looking, I shifted and positioned my legs beneath him. As Paul approached me, I sprung up and ran towards him, hitting him hard with my shoulder. It seemed to take him by surprise, and I took advantage of his momentary confusion to pick up the ice chest the only way I could with my hands bound, by one handle, and swung it at him. It connected with a dull thud and he fell backwards. I turned towards Katie. Now I could see her legs. It was as if something had been gnawing at them. I could see bone peeking through her torn jeans. I knew I'd have to come back for her later. There was no way I could move her in her current state. I ran up the stairs and my heart sunk when I found I was in a part of the house I had never seen before. It looked older and lacked the meticulous care applied to restoring and cleaning the rest of the place. I wonder which of the many doors led out, but the fact that one door was nailed shut served to both further dash my hopes and answer that question. I limped. My leg was asleep. Through the dusty hallway, I found a room where light seeped through two small windows and locked the door. I've called the police. All I can do now is wait. I hope I can either get one of the sealed windows open or the police find me here before Paul or one of the other residents.